Kirit Mukherjee of the Arlington Courthouse Greens and host of the Green Hour. Courthouse relates to the death penalty, and as a timestamp on this program, the Supreme Court this week has made a major decision on juvenile death penalty. We launched this program last November following the presidential election to provide a different vision of what society is and can become compared to the path that both major parties and their corporate allies are leading the nation today. To understand the goals of an alternative course requires that we understand our current predicament and how we got here. This is essentially part 2 of a 3-part series, Challenging Corporate Power in the United States by Multinational Corporations. In the first program, we introduced our listeners to the wide scope and pervasiveness of corporate control over most facets of society in our daily lives, including political, economic, social, media, cultural, manufacturing, food production, distribution, and even in our schools. We discussed how corporations enjoy more rights than real, live, flesh and blood human beings, how the tendency of corporate greed for mergers and acquisitions has led to oligopolies across most major industries not seen since maybe the late 1800s. And the spread of corporate rule globally through institutions such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and trade treaties like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, have exacerbated the problem. During the program, we'll be showing slides that summarize some of the main points covered in the first program, just as reminders. And in this program, we would like to explore how the United States came to this point of corporate rule and how the rights of corporations have evolved over the past 30 years to the detriment of we the people and fundamental democratic with a small d principles. With us is Paul Hughes, co-chair of the Northern Virginia Green Party, which covers Fairfax County, Falls Church, Alexandria, and Paul will help guide us through this topic. Welcome, Paul.
Good to be here, Kirit. Thought it might be helpful in the second series, after we highlighted in the first, more or less, kind of the situation we find ourselves in, how we got here. And what we'd like to do is kind of take you back a little bit. It may sound a little esoteric initially, but I think it'll evolve into current understanding of where we stand in relation to corporations. A corporation is a different kind of way of organizing for business purposes, unlike a sole proprietorship or a partnership where the individual or the partners are liable for their actions. In a corporation, it's a group of people who pool their money, pool the risk, and in effect, when there get to be a large number of people, they want some limit on their risks that other people can commit them to. So they seek a charter from a state for a corporation which limits their liability essentially to the amount of funds that they've invested. As corporations get larger and larger, of course, you find that the lack of social kind of control mechanisms that you find within a small firm no longer operate within a large firm. So the focus becomes very much standard of maximizing the return for the stockholders, their dividends, and not certainly performing necessarily in any social conscience, because that is kind of beyond their purview. They're strictly bottom line oriented.
Well, let me ask you a question there. We generally all think that we're knowledgeable about corporations, but what is the definition of a corporation? You can walk us through that.
The definition is simply to maximize the return on assets.
Profit.
Well, profit is one way of doing it. Investing in items that bring you dividends or whatever. But the idea is to increase the amount of initial investment by the shareholders that invested with you. And there's a corporate veil that exists, as I indicated before, between the actions of the corporation, which in many cases can go bankrupt, but the shareholders are not responsible for that. They're only responsible financially up to the amount that they invested. If there's total bankruptcy, really the creditors are the ones who foot the bill rather than the investors. I could take you back in some areas here I think that might be helpful in terms of the initial founding of corporations. They were started back in as early as the 1500s with Dutch trading companies, and they were granted charters by, say, the crown or the king or the queen or so, and they were given, as you can well imagine, exclusively to the elite and the powerful, the rich in those countries. The East India Company, which was one of the earlier ones formed to do exploration in the New World here on this continent, formed in 1600. And as things evolved with them, the Crown began to give them exclusive right to the sale of tea in the colonies. They could even get a rebate if they didn't sell all the tea they were supposed to. This ultimately led to the famous Boston Tea Party, where this was undermining the merchants who were able to get tea from other sources, either from the Dutch or so rather than the English, or were able to go out and get it on their own. This whole undermining of a lot of the smaller businesses and merchants was one of the telltale clues that they wanted to divorce themselves from England, from that kind of power of these corporations, and they did wield a lot of power.
Paul, did our founding fathers have any particular attitude towards corporations?
They did. And there was a schism. The attitude was they had seen what the East India Company and the Virginia Company and so forth had done to the colonies. They certainly feared any sort of growth of those kinds of monopolies of commerce, as Jefferson referred to them. And they were determined that was not going to happen here. They did not even make mention of corporations in the Constitution. It was all about freedom, liberty, rights, particularly natural rights of human beings. And natural rights are those from John Locke and some other prior political philosophers that said, you know, your rights that you have as a human being are those by virtue of your being a human being. And that, you know, an inanimate organization, say like a government or corporations, were not entitled to those same rights. And that launched a major schism that went through the writing of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which, as everyone knows, followed that, between Jefferson and Madison, on one hand, who favored, you know, putting something even in the Bill of Rights that would prevent monopolies of commerce, as he referred to it, and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, who feared the rabble, you know, the common people, and was one of the reasons that the Senate, at their behest, was an appointed Senate by the state legislators.
Let me stop you there on one point.
Mm-hmm.
How were corporations considered at all in the Constitution?
None whatsoever. There was no reference to them. It was all about people having natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, of, by, and for the people. It was about how individuals controlled their destiny. And they could do it through corporations or the government through their representative government and legislature. But no, corporations were not even mentioned in the Constitution. And what that meant was then that the authority to grant charters to corporations and everything went to the states. And let me just, if I can, this is a book, I encourage viewers to take a look at it, Unequal Protection. It's kind of a play on the 14th Amendment of equal protection, which was done to free the slaves and so forth. But in effect, this book outlines the whole evolution, which is something I think just from a perspective a lot of people should read. But at that time, corporations were given licenses by state governments that were totally revocable if they exceeded or didn't fulfill their charter purposes, or if they misbehaved or committed felonies or didn't carry out the purpose for which they were created. the owners were personally liable, even though it was a corporation. All their officers, directors could not claim they were just, following through on what the corporation wanted. They were personally liable. They were required to come. Directors were required to come from the actual stockholders. They couldn't come from outside directors. The headquarters had to be in the state in which the principal office and activity of the business was located, not in Delaware and some of the lax states and those that give particularly tax benefits to corporations and lax management and oversight. And many of them were created for specific time periods, which meant like the canals, they were supposed to be built, in a certain time. The legislators told them what they could charge for it. Once the thing was built, it was operating, the company went out of business. And they were prohibited from making any political contributions, which, as we know today, they're one of the biggest financiers of both our major parties. And they were even prohibited from making charitable deductions, or charitable donations, I should say, for fear of the importance that would weigh on the decisions of the nonprofit organization. So they were very closely regulated, and all that held true really up to probably shortly after the Civil War.
So given that, what would you say are the origins of the corporation in this country as we know it today?
The whole personhood issue?
No, the corporation that we're talking about in today's terms. What are the origins, since it wasn't part of the Constitution?
Well, they were chartered by the states to build canals, to set up banks, to do specific things for the governments at the time, and then people wanted to get in business, and they were given charters, but they were on a very short leash. It was only with the Civil War and the tremendous power that accrued to the railroads at the time because of having to ship troops and supplies, and they had to build railroads fast. The government gave them a lot of free land on which to build these railroads. They gained a tremendous amount of power. They began to lobby very, very much after the Civil War, claiming that the 14th Amendment gave them rights to protest the differentiated taxes that they were being charged as their railroads went through the various states. These arguments went on from the end of the Civil War until the early 1880s, and then ultimately came down in came to a head in a Supreme Court decision called Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company in 1886. And what happened in this is really an accident of history, and it just shows what one kind of turn of events can turn a whole country around, and it's time to start thinking, do we want to base our whole society on this accident of history? In effect, this argument, this repeated argument over and over again by these powerful railroad attorneys and so forth, were in effect, just falling not on deaf ears, but they've been played so many times that in effect in this particular case, which wasn't even addressing the personhood issue and the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court Chief Justice Morris Waite more or less said at the beginning of the case that we don't want to hear the 14th Amendment arguments from you corporations because we fully believe you do have those rights. Of course, he was a former railroad attorney, as were several others on the Supreme Court at the time. But it was just in passing, and then they went on to hear the case and then rendered a decision on the case.
So we're talking here about the origins of what we discussed in the first show, corporate personhood.
That's correct.
And how it came to be that there is such a thing as corporate personhood.
And what an accident of history.
But before we got to this case, wasn't there regulation by the state to involving corporations?
Well, those were all those things I was referring to in here in terms of their formation, what they could not do, how they could do it, that sort of thing. But a lot of them were, in fact, put out of existence when they didn't follow through. So they were under a tight leash. It's only when you started getting the large railroads and some of the other larger trusts, the Standard Oil, New Jersey, everybody's familiar with that, all of these companies began to dislike those regulations that they were having to be governed under, and they were trying to get out from under it. Thus, the reason they were pressing the Supreme Court to rule that, in fact, they were persons. Well, this particular case didn't rule on that. However, and this is the accident of history, the court reporter for the Supreme Court just mentioned that in what they call the head notes of the case, Supreme Court case decision. And in that, he just alluded to the fact that even though the justices, or the justices indicated, or the Chief Justice indicated that he did feel that they had the 14th Amendment equal protection that regular natural persons do, but that wasn't something he was addressing in this case. They went on, gave the decision, and that was it. Well, from that head note, however, subsequent people, attorneys, pleadings for corporations use that as a precedent. And it became to be, in effect, de facto law. And when in fact head notes carry no legal import whatsoever, it was just the kind of introductory paragraph leading to the summary of the actual case. The people have treated that all these years and to this day as part of the decision.
Paul, what are some of the things that an average person might not realize have come about because of that corporate personhood? What aspects of everyday Joe Arlington might be impacted by that?
Good question. The corporations have, just under the First Amendment, our First Amendment, the right to free speech, assembly, to meet with their legislators. As you know, the right of corporations to give political campaign contributions is a version of free speech, and so ruled by our recent 1950s or so Supreme Court decision. They can actually even deduct that expense of those campaign contributions as a legitimate business expense on their taxes. Obviously, they employ armies of lobbyists, all of which are tax deductible. You and I can't do that. They also have the right not to speak, which is, oddly enough, a First Amendment right. They don't have to inform customers or consumers of deleterious aspects of their products. Cigarettes come leaping to mind. The last 50 years before they were required to put the warning, Surgeon General's warning on the packet. They certainly fight such things and generally win, as recently as the last couple of weeks, in Congress against corporate disclosure or weakening management control by requirements that outside public interest, perhaps managers be allowed to sit on the board. Currently, management in corporations wants to maintain control, and they want as little government regulation as possible. And the Fourth Amendment, which is the protection of unreasonable searches and seizures, where they've carried that one is they do not now have to submit to random government inspections, say of OSHA or EPA, when they want to observe on site what they're doing. But employees, in fact, do give up their rights, oddly enough, when they go into work for a company. They can be monitored on their emails and their speech and so forth. But back to the Fourth Amendment, the privacy and freedom available under preventing unreasonable searches prevents antitrust efforts because there's a lot of collusion that goes on for which they claim proprietary interests and so forth in their internal communications, which are hard to get at.
Well, why don't we take an issue that's right at the forefront of the news.
Sure.
We've got Congress talking about corporate lawsuit reform. How does that issue that supposedly corporations are unfairly cited in all these class action lawsuits, how do you look at that from a corporate personhood point of view?
It's exactly 180 degrees of where we ought to be. Corporations should be controlled by persons. In this case, they're in effect saying we don't want persons to be entitled to sue us for something we may have done wrong. And my sense is, and others who feel the same as I do, that this isn't really their call. They are a creature created by people, and people ought to be in control of them, not them have a way to deny people the power to regulate or call them to task if they've done something wrong. And from the standpoint of class action suits, I think we all know that, you or I trying to go up against a large corporation with our limited dollars versus, their deep pockets, that's hardly equal protection. And that is really what is behind the title of this book, Unequal Protection, that Tom Hartman, that I would strongly recommend viewers read.
So
That's
we're
what it's
talking,
about.
and we're talking about how we got to this point. And what
Right.
we're saying is that we've gotten to a point where corporations, the deck is so heavily stacked
Exactly.
in their favor
Mhm.
as opposed to an average citizen.
Yes.
Isn't that what we're saying?
That's it. And it's one person described it to me at one point, which I thought was a very vivid illustration. You take, man created a toaster, make toast.
Okay.
You don't give a toaster rights to sue you, right of free speech, all these other kinds of things that we give. A corporation is exactly the same thing. It's a charter on a piece of paper that's man-made by, humans. And they can unmake it, should be able to unmake it as fast as they put it together if it's doing something that is not in concert with the public interest and general society's benefit.
Let's pursue that right to free speech that you mentioned. Isn't it true that Nike Corporation claimed that it had the right of free speech to make false claims in a California court case?
Yeah, and I
To make
think
claims about its
That's right.
product that are not substantiated by research?
that's right. And I think that falls in the area of, in real estate, it's called puffery. In other fields, it has to do with kind of more bravado in your advertising. Our product is the best. Well, you can't just say anything and be allowed to get away with it, and yet that is exactly, as you say, that is exactly what they maintain. There's been in the free speech area too, I think, something that kind of everybody remembers Oprah Winfrey being taken to the woodshed, if you will, by the Cattlemen's Association when she had just kind of offhandedly, after interviewing a guest about mad cow disease on her program, she said, boy, I'm not sure I want to eat hamburger anymore. And if you recall, it took her, with her millions, to go down to Texas and defend herself against libeling their industry because they claimed that she cost them profits and earnings and sales that they would have made otherwise, and that she had been harmful to their industry and has, in effect, libeled or slandered their industry. So that's somebody with her reputation and her notoriety and everything else. That was a signal to the rest of us. Better watch where the line you're crossing because, in effect, we will come at you. And there's, as you know, Carrot, the term slap suits, comes into view or into play a lot of these times. People may not be familiar with these, but these are suits that are brought by corporations in order to either shut public interest groups up or individuals, or to drive them into bankruptcy with the tremendous legal costs that it takes to defend themselves against these kinds of corporate charges. And this is done to silence that sort of thing. But I think despite all of that, there's been some recent polls, one in 2000, Business Week and Lou Harris, that asked Americans whether businesses gain too much power over too many aspects of our life. And some 70 to 82% in one way or another said yes to that fact. And that's an overwhelming majority of people feel that corporations have become too powerful in this country, both in this country, and we haven't talked that much internationally, other than a couple allusions to WTO, but that is really carried into that.
Tag into that on one point. Obviously, Arlington Courthouse Greens worked for a couple of years on the living wage campaign. and going out and talking to people on the street,
Right.
I barely met one person who said, I am not for a living wage. Almost every average working person said that companies should pay a wage which enables you to live
Mm-hmm.
adequately in Arlington. So obviously there is some sense out there that people recognize that, you know, corporations have some obligation,
That's right.
some minimum standard of providing health insurance or whatever it may be,
Yeah.
just in that one campaign. So
And
I
that's
guess
it.
we're getting to what we may discuss in the next show, which is there hope, and what can the average person do to educate themselves, right?
Exactly.
Or do something about the problem.
And we've begun this in the first two shows here. There's other discussion groups that some national groups that feel very strongly about this and put together, and would encourage people to call either you or myself to find out more about those. But it certainly encourage people, don't think you can do this yourself. In this day and age, to try to take on this single-handedly or worry about it single-handedly, you can't do it. You need to form up with other organizations that feel strongly on this issue. And there are some great things going on nationally, which we will talk about in the legal area, and even in the some of the other tactics and strategies that people are using to try to overcome this corporate domination we have.
So just to summarize, in the first show we talked about what exactly the problem is, why we need to, what the problem is with corporate power. In the this show we talked about how we got to this situation, and in the next show we're going to talk about what we can do about it.
Exactly.
What we can do to address the problem, take some type of action that Tom Hartman in his book and others have
Mm-hmm.
outlined, that citizen power, Ralph Nader style,
Mm-hmm.
that we can do. So I thank you, Paul, once again, and I thank our viewers for joining us on the Green Hour, and look forward to seeing you in our next installment. Yeah.
Yeah, that really helped with those 5, 3, 1. I tell you, big up.